If you haven't heard of Buford Pusser, you are in for a treat. He is one of the most legendary badass sheriffs in U.S. history. As sheriff, Pusser survived 7 stabbings and 8 shootings. He killed 2 people in the line of duty and destroyed over 40 stills during his virtual one-man war against moonshining and other vices along the Mississippi-Tennessee state line. His efforts have inspired several books, songs, movies, and a TV series, and he was only the sheriff for 6 short years. So what kind of hell do you have to raise to generate that kind of buzz in that short a period of time? Well, you're about to find out. I'm Joshua Roberts, attorney at law, and you are watching A Lawyer Up. In today's episode, we are taking a look at the life and times of Buford Pusser. We're going to take a look at his battles against the Dixie Mafia and the State Line Mob, and we're going to go back and look at the history of both of those groups so that you can fully appreciate the magnitude of their collision with Sheriff Pusser when he took office. We're going to talk about the assassination attempts, the acts of revenge, and the bodies that were left in the wake, including the guy who escaped from prison just to try to kill Sheriff Pusser. We're going to talk about the movie Walking Tall that was made about Sheriff Pusser's life, and then we're going to talk about what finally put him in the ground. All of that in today's episode. If you like the episode, hit that like button for me. If you got something to say, you got a comment, put it in the comment sections below. If you haven't subscribed, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button. And last but not least, you guys know it, I love it when you share my videos on social media. Today's episode is sponsored by Webull, the online broker that allows you to buy and sell stocks or crypto or whatever you are into directly from your phone or computer. Webull is free to join and it's free to use. There is no cost to buy or sell, so it's commission-free trading. Better yet, when you sign up and you link a bank account and deposit as little as 1 cent, Webull will give you 2 free stocks worth at least $3 per share, so it's free money as well. So if you would like to join the over 2 million Webull traders, all you have to do is click on the link in the description below. Buford Pusser was born in McNairy County, Tennessee on December 12th of 1937 to Carl and Helen Pusser. His father was the police chief of Adamsville, Tennessee, an office that Buford would also later hold. Buford would grow to stand 6 feet 6 inches tall and was a high school football and basketball star. He joined the United States Marine Corps after graduation, but his service soon ended during recruit training when he was medically discharged due to his asthma. From there, he moved to Chicago, where he started wrestling under the name Buford the Bull. He then married Pauline Mullins on December 5th of 1959, and they returned home to Adamsville in 1962, where he became the city's police chief for 2 years. Then, after the McNairy County Sheriff James Dickey was killed in an auto accident, Pusser was elected at the age of 26, becoming the youngest sheriff in Tennessee history. It was 1964, and in the 2 years since he'd returned home, he'd gotten a belly full of the organized crime in the area. So once crowned sheriff, Pusser promptly began trying to eliminate the groups, namely the Dixie Mafia and the State Line Mob. Now, the Dixie Mafia was a larger criminal organization composed mainly of white Southerners based in Biloxi, Mississippi, and it was operating in several different states. The State Line Mob was the local criminal syndicate that operated in McNairy County, where Pusser was sheriff. Now, a little history on these groups is in order. Now, there have always been ornery folk in this part of the country dating all the way back to the Whiskey Rebellion, which was where the distillers there in Tennessee refused to pay a whiskey tax that was put forth by the federal government under George Washington. And this was in 1791, so we're going back a minute. That rebellion actually led to a secessionist movement resulting, briefly, in the Republic of Franklin, in what is now known as Eastern Tennessee. You should Google it if you have never heard of the Republic of Franklin, because it's a fascinating story. In the end, it was, of course, never recognized as an independent state and would soon rejoin the Union, but the underlying ideals would live on. That being the view that the federal government was oppressive and that criminal enterprises against it are justified. So, beginning in the late 50s, a gang that the media would dub the Dixie Mafia began working as a loosely knit group of traveling criminals engaging in residential burglary, robbery, and theft. Unlike members of the Italian Mafia, members of the Dixie Mafia were not connected by family or country of origin. And in the beginning, at least, they did not function with any set chain of command. But the Dixie Mafia had one rule that the members were expected to obey: thou shalt not snitch to the cops. A lot of the members of the Dixie Mafia were former state or federal prisoners, usually recruited while they were still in prison. Over time, the gang became known for carrying out contract killings, usually against former members who were most often murdered because they testified or threatened to testify against current members of the gang. The Strip in Biloxi, Mississippi would become home base for the Dixie Mafia, and Mike Gillich Jr. rose to be the group's unofficial leader, owning a string of motels, nightclubs, strip joints, and gambling dens. One of the gang's most notable members and future boss was Kirksey McCord Nix Jr., who, as you will learn, was the subject of multiple encounters with Sheriff Buford Pusser. The terms Dixie Mafia and Southern Mafia are often used interchangeably, although experts note that there are distinctions between these two groups. Now, the State Line Mob was an association of criminal elements that operated in the 1950s and the 1960s along U.S. Route 45 near the Mississippi-Tennessee state line of Alcorn County, Mississippi, and McNairy County, Tennessee. That's Sheriff Buford Pusser's county. Carl Douglas Towhead White, who was closely connected with the Dixie Mafia, was the State Line Mob's leader. The State Line Mob was involved in bootleg liquor, gambling, prostitution, tourist fleecing, robbery, and murder. The organization owned and operated motels and restaurants and clubs along the Mississippi-Tennessee state line. These establishments were centers for every form of vice and reaped hundreds of thousands of dollars from sales of illegal moonshine and other contraband. And it was the State Line Mob that gained national attention throughout the 60s for its ongoing feud with Sheriff Buford Pusser. The film Walking Tall and its sequels are specifically based on Pusser's war against the State Line Mob and other local criminal elements. So the backstory is that during Buford Pusser's first year in office, he took to getting rid of illegal stills and combating these illegal speakeasies, if you will, that provided alcohol, gambling, and women. The main bootleggers and moonshine distributors in town were Jack and Louise Hathcock, who owned the Shamrock Motel and Restaurant, W.O. Hathcock, who owned the Plantation Club, and Carl Towhead White, who owned the White Iris. And these clubs, as they like to call them, were also notorious for robbing unsuspecting tourists as they would pass through town. And the story of Pusser's battle against the State Line Mob really begins just before he took office. On May 22 of 1964, Louise Hathcock would shoot and kill Jack Hathcock. Louise would state that Jack had beaten her at the Shamrock Motel that they both owned together. She recounted that she got her .38 pistol from the dresser drawer and shot Jack 5 times. Witnesses would say that he staggered out of Unit 1 at the motel and stumbled approximately 100 feet before collapsing between the motel and the restaurant nearby. Louise was not prosecuted primarily because she had cuts and bruises which verified her abuse story. It was also during this time period that Louise started in on a romantic relationship with Carl Towhead White, which becomes important here a little later. So, a few months after this time, Sheriff Pusser takes office at age 26. Now, Towhead White was the biggest bootlegger in the county by far, and Buford Pusser, being a local, was no idiot. He already knew where a lot of the local stills were located, so he went to busting them, some 40 or so in his first year in office. He hit so many of Towhead's stills that Carl was forced to move his moonshine operation out of the county to get away from the sheriff. And while moving momentarily escaped Sheriff Pusser, he could not outrun the feds, who arrested and jailed him in 1965. So Towhead was out of the picture for the moment. So let's jump to February 1st of 1966. Some tourists from Illinois contacted the sheriff and said that they had been robbed and threatened with a gun by Louise Hathcock while staying at the Shamrock Motel. So Chief Pusser, armed with a search warrant and 2 deputies, headed to the inn. The chief would find Louise in an intoxicated condition in the motel office. Now, the Shamrock was a single-level motel with a covered carport in front of the office. There was a detached restaurant, which is what they called the club, where the booze and the gambling and the prostitution was had. When the sheriff confronted her, Louise said that she wanted to speak to him in private and asked the sheriff to step into her living quarters, which was Unit 1 at the motel and whose bedroom was attached to the office. So she slid into the room from the office while the sheriff went around to the room's front door. Once inside, she grabbed her .38 from the dresser drawer and fired it at Sheriff Pusser as he entered the room and walked towards the bed. Well, she missed, and Sheriff Pusser returned fire, striking her 3 times and killing her where she stood. Sheriff Pusser would be cleared of all wrongdoing, although rumors swirled that the sheriff had actually gunned her down first, then retrieved her gun and fired it back towards the door to bolster his argument of self-defense. However, that rumor was never proven, and in the end, Louise Hathcock, queen of the State Line Mob, was dead. Now, news of the killing of Louise Hathcock would enrage her lover, Carl Towhead White, who, as you may recall, was still in federal prison. But by December of 1996, Towhead would escape from the minimum security prison where he was being held, and he had revenge on his mind. Within a month of Towhead's escape, Sheriff Buford Pusser would stop a light green Chrysler heading south on Highway 45, which was speeding. As Sheriff Pusser approached the vehicle, he was shot 3 times and left for dead by the side of the highway. Most people believe this was the work of Towhead White, as he would actually turn himself back into the federal prison 3 days following the shooting. But Sheriff Pusser, tough as nails, would get up, drive himself to the hospital, and survive the event. During the next 7 months, it is generally accepted that Towhead White learned that Pusser had survived the attack. He made a phone call from prison to a gangster named Kirksey McCord Nix Jr. and asked him to finish the job and to kill Sheriff Pusser. So on August 11th of 1967, it is believed that Nix and 2 other men partied into the late hours at the Shamrock Motel. And it was the early morning hours of August 12th when Sheriff Pusser received a phone call at his home telling him there was some sort of trouble on New Hope Road. As he gets up and prepares to go, his wife, Pauline, decides she wants to tag along. It is still dark when the sheriff and his wife arrive in the area and travel past the New Hope Church. It is at this moment that a dark-colored Cadillac with 3 men inside pulls out from behind the church and pursues the sheriff's vehicle with their lights off. According to the sheriff, as he approached a low-water bridge on the road, all of a sudden the headlights flicked on and bullets started flying. Glass shatters, Pauline is struck, and the sheriff puts the pedal to the metal as he realizes it's an ambush. After speeding down New Hope Road for a spell and no longer seeing the car behind him, he pulls over to the side of the road to check on his wife, who was slumped down in the seat. Just as he discovers that his wife had been shot in the head, bright lights flash back on from behind, and the assassins unload on the sheriff. Chief Pusser would be struck in the face, blowing away his lower jaw. Believing that no one could survive the onslaught, the killers would speed away. The sheriff would try to call for help on his car radio, but his jaw was so mangled that his garbled pleas were unintelligible. Regardless, the dispatcher would later say that even though he couldn't make out the words, he knew the sheriff was in trouble. Pusser would be rushed to a hospital in Memphis where he would stay for 18 days. Doctors said that he was struck on the left side of his jaw by at least 2 and possibly 3 rounds from a .30 caliber carbine. His wife Pauline would be buried while he lay in a hospital bed. Beaufort would undergo 16 surgeries in the following years to repair his face the best that they could. Publicly, Buford Pusser would name Kirksey Nix Jr. as the shooter. And a local resident, Jerry Skinner, would say it was common knowledge in the area that the ambush was set up by Towhead White. And although publicly accused, Nix was never formally charged because the sheriff could not positively identify him as the shooter. And for what it's worth, Nix has denied being involved in the ambush of the Pussers. So, wife dead, fresh out of the hospital, face rebuilt, you'd think he'd just retire. But not Buford Pusser. He went right back to work and in a little more than a year shot and killed an intoxicated Charles Russell Hamilton on Christmas Day of 1968 after responding to a complaint that Hamilton had threatened his landlord with a gun. It was also in 1968 that Towhead White was released from prison. And on April 4th of the following year, Towhead would find himself at the El Rey Motel in Mississippi with the hotel owner's wife. Accounts were that the two had pulled in front of motel room number 3 when husband Barry Smith Jr. confronted them. Witnesses would state that Towhead started shooting, causing Smith to retreat to the motel office to get his gun. He would return to the encounter and ultimately killed Towhead White. Now, some say that Smith was actually laying on the roof of the El Rey Motel and shot White through the windshield as he drove up. Others claim he was shot from behind. Still, some even claim that Sheriff Pusser paid Smith to kill Towhead off-site and then brought him to the motel to stage a shootout scene. Regardless, what followed was a half-hearted attempt by law enforcement to investigate the shooting, and no one was ever charged. So at the end of the day, notorious gangster and leader of the State Line mob, Towhead White, was dead. Pusser was ineligible for re-election as sheriff in 1970 due to term limits then in effect. So he ran for and was elected as constable of the city of Adamsville, where he would serve for 2 years, and during which time Hollywood made a movie about his life. Walking Tall was a violent, surprisingly successful movie about Pusser's efforts to clean up his small town. Now, many of the locals weren't too fond of how they were portrayed in the movie, and they kind of blamed Pusser for that. So when he ran for sheriff again in 1972, he was defeated by the incumbent, in part due to the controversy and scuttlebutt that surrounded the making of the movie. During this same time period, 1972, Kirksey Nix would be sentenced to life in prison in the Louisiana State Penitentiary, not for the murder of Pusser's wife, but for the 1971 murder of Italian mobster and New Orleans grocery store executive Frank Corso. And once in prison, Nix didn't just quit the biz. As the then head of the Dixie Mafia, he spearheaded a famous extortion racket that was dubbed the, quote, Lonely Heart Scam by authorities. This scam involved ads placed in national publications that were targeted towards homosexual men. And when these men would respond, the group would either get pity money from them by selling them a sob story, or if that didn't work, they would threaten to expose the men's secret. And remember, this was the late 70s and the early 80s, where coming out of the closet as gay was still a big deal. So they were able to extort large sums of cash with this scheme. Now, the Dixie Mafia's law firm at the time was Hallett and Sherry, Peter Hallett and Vincent Sherry, who specialized in criminal law. The money from the Lonely Heart scam was being given to attorney Pete Hallett to launder or hold or whatever you want to call it, but he did neither. He spent it. Now, the law firm would essentially dissolve over time as Sherry went on to be a judge and Hallett became the mayor of Biloxi, Mississippi. But even as mayor, Hallett had to know a day of reckoning was coming. And when the Dixie Mafia ultimately asked for their money, he didn't have it. So to get himself out of trouble, Hallett told the mob that his old law partner, Vincent Sherry, had stolen it. Well, as you might guess, that didn't sit too well with the Dixie Mafia. So on September 14th of 1987, and this is hotly disputed by all of the parties, but it is alleged that a yellow Ford was driven off a used car lot in Biloxi, Mississippi. Thomas Leslie Holcomb, a hitman from Texas who had been paid $20,000, pulls up to the Sherry home, knocks on the door, and is welcomed inside, after which time he fires a silenced .22 caliber Ruger 4 times at Judge Sherry, who falls to the floor. Wife and councilwoman Margaret Sherry would exit the bedroom to investigate the commotion, only to be shot 4 times as well. Somewhat baffled by the murders, as there was no sign of forced entry, it took 10 years for law enforcement to put all of the pieces together. But ultimately, Dixie Mafia leaders Kirksey Nix and Mike Gillich, as well as the Trigger Man, would be found guilty of the murder-for-hire hit of Judge Vincent Sherry and his wife Margaret. Co-conspirator, Biloxi Mayor Pete Hallett, who is the one who actually stole the money from the Dixie Mafia and blamed it on his law partner, received 18 years for his role. The others got a life sentence, except for Nix, who was already in prison for life at the time. He was sentenced to life in isolation for the balance of his days. The book Mississippi Mud chronicles the murder of Vince and Margaret Sherry and the subsequent investigation in great detail if you are interested. Also really interesting is that during this time, the Dixie Mafia would develop such a huge presence within the local law enforcement system in Biloxi that the federal authorities would designate the entire Harrison County Sheriff's Office as a criminal enterprise. The FBI reported that officers were, quote, releasing prisoners from county jail for money, safeguarding drug shipments, and hiding fugitives. In some locations, the infiltration was so bad that, quote, corrupt local deputies regularly extorted local businesses, aided prostitutes, and in some cases murdered political opponents in cold blood. But of course, that was 40 years ago, and the department claims to be much improved today. So in the end, all of Buford Pusser's enemies would wind up dead or in prison. Which begs the question, what happened to Buford Pusser? Well, Pusser would live to see Nix sentenced to life in prison in 1971, but he would not live to see the Lonely Heart scandal we just discussed. Pusser would die on August 21st of 1974 of injuries sustained in a one-car automobile accident. Earlier that day, he had actually contracted with Bing Crosby Productions in Memphis to portray himself in the sequel to Walking Tall. That evening, after celebrating, he was returning home from the McNairy County Fair in his specially modified Corvette. Pusser would lose control of his vehicle, slide across the highway, across the other lane, and strike an embankment at a high rate of speed, ejecting him from his vehicle. He would break his neck in the accident and the car would catch fire and burn. Local speculation as to the cause included rumors of sabotage to the steering mechanism and the tie rods. The state trooper who worked the accident, Paul Irvin, claimed that Pusser's death was caused by high speeds, drunk driving, and his failure to wear a seatbelt. Ultimately, it would be Buford's daughter, Buford Pusser, a passenger in a separate car who would come upon the scene of the accident moments later. So it came to pass that 7 years after the ambush that killed wife Pauline, Buford Pusser was laid to rest next to her at the Adamsville Cemetery. He was only age 36. As sheriff, Pusser was credited with surviving 7 stabbings and 8 shootings. He killed 2 people in the line of duty and destroyed over 40 stills during his time in office. But the man, the myth, the legend lives on. Several singers have featured Buford Pusser in song, including the southern rock band Drive-By Truckers. Jimmy Buffett refers to an altercation between Pusser and himself in the songs Presents to Send You and Semi-True Stories. According to Buffett, he and Pusser were staying in the same Nashville motel when he decided to go out for some food. Jimmy, who had been drinking, said that he could not find his rental car and decided to climb up on top of a Cadillac for a better view. The Cadillac turned out to belong to Pusser, who was not at all pleased to find the singer atop his car. Pusser was the subject of 4 biographical books written by W.R. Morris. Pusser's daughter Dawana also released a book in 2009 entitled Walking On, which was her account of her dad's life. And as I mentioned, the 1973 movie Walking Tall was based upon Pusser's story. It was followed by 2 sequels in 1975 and 1977, a TV movie in 1978, a TV series in 81. A Walking Tall remake was released in 2004, starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson as the main character, although he was renamed Chris Vaughn. A Buford Pusser Festival is held each May in his hometown of Adamsville, Tennessee, and the Buford Pusser Museum was established at the home he lived in at the time of his death in 1974. And I'll leave you with this. Comedian Jeff Foxworthy, in his 1993 studio album, You Might Be a Redneck If, refers to Buford Pusser in a joke downplaying his wife's childbirth experience, remarking, "You don't have more stitches than Buford Pusser." Well, that's the episode. I hope you have enjoyed learning about American badass Buford Pusser. If you enjoyed the episode, hit that like button. If you got something to say or a question, put it in the comment section below. And if you haven't subscribed, what are you waiting for? Smash that subscribe button. That's all for today. I'm Joshua Roberts, attorney at law, and you've been watching Lawyer Up.
Send lawyers, guns, and money.